So duty of loyalty, I mean, it's straightforward, I suppose, in the nomenclature, right? Your job when you are on the board and you are making decisions for the board and for the organization is you need to frame everything in making those decisions that you're doing it in the best interests of the organization. And you're avoiding conflicts of interest, and potentially you're avoiding or forfeiting, I guess you could say, opportunities that would benefit you personally.
Welcome to 501 C-Suite, where nonprofit founders and leaders get straightforward legal guidance without the legal jargon. I'm Olivia Clower from Charitable Allies, and this is the place where we break down the most important issues, from bylaws to boards, so you can focus on your mission and grow your impact. Whether you're starting fresh or scaling your nonprofit, you'll find insights and real-world stories that will help you lead with confidence. This is your ally in building a stronger, smarter nonprofit. Welcome to the suite. What is your board legally required to do? Today, we're going to talk about that with attorney Spencer Rehn, who is joining us here today. Thanks for joining us, Spencer.
Yeah. Good morning, Olivia. Happy to be here.
Spencer has been on our team for a few years now.
Yeah, 3 years. 3 years and change,
Yeah, a little change. And you've been working exclusively with nonprofits basically in that time as an attorney, doing all kinds of fun things from, you've done a lot.
Yeah, a lot of dissolutions. It feels like dissolving people. I don't know why. Startups. I mean, some litigation at the beginning, not as much these days, but yeah, all over the board.
And we love the calls from people saying, hey, am I allowed to? And then insert whatever thing they've already done here.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about boards, what boards are legally required to do, all of that good kind of stuff. My goal with this episode is for us to give people something they can send a board member to say, hey, here's a quick couple of minutes on what your legal duties are as a member of this board. So let's dive in. What are, some of the legal requirements of being on a board? What do they have to do? Yeah,
that's a good question. So I kind of look at it in two different ways. One is just the generic side of it, kind of under various state law or what have you. And then the other side of it is the more programmatic is not quite the right word, but kind of where you've got your categories of things like your bylaws or your articles or board policies and procedures that have been adopted, those kinds of things. So we can start, I guess, over here with the duties, right? The three duties: the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And that applies to you no matter what if you're on a board, those duties. Even if they're not written down, it's going to be explicit in state law or even maybe implicit depending on where you live. You always have to follow those things.
Sure. All right. So let's dive into those because I think for most people, that's maybe not common knowledge.
So you're engaged, you're making informed decisions, and you're kind of paying attention to what the board is doing, what the organization is doing, and you're not just totally oblivious to what's happening.
So practically speaking, I need to show up to meetings.
Right, exactly.
But showing up isn't really enough. You've kind of got to engage and look into the information that you need to make informed decisions.
Right, yeah. And whether that's looking at meeting minutes, whether that's looking at, like I said, policies, or if, say your board chair sends out a notification ahead of the meeting saying, hey, this is what we're going to talk about. It's researching that if necessary. It's looking into that. It's understanding that, these are the things that we're going to talk about. These are our objectives. This is why we're here, type of a thing. Is you need to be engaged into that so that you're not just showing up blind at a board meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we've seen our fair share of board meetings go one way or the other, right?
Yeah, or just people that they don't realize how important it is to, when you agree to be on a board, what that really means, and they think they can just kind of fly by the seat of their pants, when in reality, you should be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of that is also looking over things like financials, the things that I might consider to be the less exciting parts of being on a board are still really important.
Yeah, and definitely. I mean, obviously not everyone's going to be the treasurer. Not everyone's going to be the CFO or the finance secretary or whatever you call it. But there's still a little bit of responsibility incumbent on you when you're on the board to at least be aware of, especially finances. I mean, really, that's going to be the most important thing, obviously, with an organization. The treasurer is the person that's in charge of it, and maybe they sign the checks or whatever. But it still is important for you being on the board to know what's happening and that you have an understanding of these transactions and those kinds of concepts.
Yeah. Okay. So I like to kind of follow these through with examples or, hypothetical scenarios maybe. So what are my risks as a board member? If I am not paying attention and something happens, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really comes down to, is it something that you should have been aware of, right? Because if it's something that there was no way you were ever going to know about it, you're going to get some leeway there. But certainly when you've joined a board and you've taken that responsibility on for yourself, if something bad happens, whatever that looks like, misappropriation, theft, whatever, or a bad business agreement, a bad relationship or a conflict of interest that pops up, we can get into that potentially later, right? But there's still going to be a level of liability on you for allowing those things to happen and for not, being aware that this is a problem potentially.
Yeah. Now, liability is one of those words that I think lawyers throw around like candy. So at a very base level, what is liability for board members?
Yeah. So, generally this goes back to what I said just a few minutes ago. If it can be proven that while you were on the board and these things happened, you were exercising, the care of an ordinary prudent person, you're probably going to be fine.
Sure.
Obviously that's not a blanket statement, things can happen, right? But as long as you were exercising even kind of that baseline of prudency, you're probably going to be fine and you're not going to run into any liability. Now, a lot of the time, the liability is going to be more from the kind of the business side of it or the corporate side of it rather than personal liability. Personal liability is going to be, more common in a situation where you did something actively to harm the organization.
Yeah.
Or something that was illegal or, something like that. Like you have to kind of make that knowing kind of action, I guess you could say.
Sure. So if I am an irresponsible board member and something's happened with the organization, it could actually make things worse for the organization that I'm trying to serve.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That makes sense. And I know that sometimes leads to problems with insurance as well.
Yeah. Depending on, the way your policies are structured, right? You can sometimes hurt your chances of getting insurance coverage, right? If you knowingly, like I said, did something that harmed the organization such that, hey, we're having to make an insurance claim now.
Well, all right. So I feel pretty good about duty of care. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to duty of loyalty.
Yeah. So duty of loyalty, I mean, it's straightforward, I suppose, in the nomenclature, right? Your job when you are on the board and you are making decisions for the board and for the organization is you need to frame everything in making those decisions that you're doing it in the best interests of the organization. And you're avoiding conflicts of interest and potentially you're avoiding or forfeiting, I guess you could say, opportunities that would benefit you personally, right? Because you're on the board now, so you know what you're looking for, these types of business transactions you're thinking about entering into. Say you own a company or somebody else in your family owns a company, right? That could benefit from this business. That the nonprofit wants to engage with. Well, sometimes you have to forego those opportunities if it's not going to be as advantageous for the nonprofit. Basically, the idea you could say is that everything that you do while you are wearing the nonprofit hat, it needs to benefit the nonprofit, right? It can't benefit other organizations or you personally. So it's kind of the baseline of what that means.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go through this with a hypothetical. I think that'll be helpful.
Sure.
So I am sitting on a board. I make websites for a living. Mm-hmm. Okay. The nonprofit that I am serving on the board of needs a website. Mm-hmm. Can my company put in a bid to do that website?
Yeah, so they can. The caveat, right, is that if the board is going to consider that and say they get 5 bids or 3 bids and one of them is your company,
sure,
they can consider that. Any vote or any sort of, affirmative conversation about it, you have to recuse yourself from, or you otherwise cannot vote for yourself. You can't vote for your own private company in that type of scenario. But there's no blanket prohibition against it. It just needs to be, the transaction needs to be for fair market value, and you need to make sure you record it in your meeting minutes that, hey, we understand this is a conflict because Joe's on the board and this is Joe's company, but we do think that legitimately it presents the best opportunity for us as a nonprofit to do XYZ thing.
Sure.
I think, my rule of thumb that I often tell clients is make sure you put everything in writing, right? I'm an attorney. I like things in writing so that there's a legitimate paper trail and a legitimate argument to any regulator that might care someday or whatever that, hey, we did our due diligence and we considered, these 3 options. Yes, one of them was our board member's company, but you can see here, look, he recused himself and we had these conversations and, we went into this transaction with eyes wide open.
Okay, right. And it's one thing if my website company, for example, put in a bid that looks similar to the other bids that we got. It's another if I'm saying, hey, I'm going to charge them double what I'd normally charge because I know they're going to say yes because I'm on this board.
Right.
That's more of a problem.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But of course, nothing's stopping me as a board member from giving them a big discount either.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also an option.
Well, let's get into duty of obedience. So out of our three, this is our last one. What do we need to know about duty of obedience?
I think I just said this, honestly, but duty of obedience is the most straightforward one, to me at least, because it basically just means, you need to make sure you're following the law. Federal law, state law, and then also your bylaws and your articles, right? If you've got, specific things in there, it really could be anything, right? You make sure that you're following proper voting procedures or you're following proper election procedures for officers or regular board members, what have you. So really it's just, again, while you got the nonprofit hat on and you're doing things for the nonprofit, you need to make sure you're doing things that are legal and that you are not violating the law. So,
easy enough.
Easy enough.
Easy enough. And as far as following bylaws go, those are legally binding. We have another episode about that topic. So feel free to go back and listen to that episode if you missed that one on what needs to be in those bylaws. Because I think we've seen before people having trouble following their bylaws when they're uber specific, right?
Or not even knowing what their bylaws say.
Yeah, that's a bit of a problem. That's a bit of a problem.
Yeah. One other note I'd make on this thing too, following the law also means keeping up with your reporting.
Okay. So what kind of reporting do they usually need to file?
Well, the most common, right, is the IRS 990. Yes, you get a little bit of a grace period if you miss a couple years, but you still should file them annually. And then some states, it just depends, right, on the level of requirements. Many states have moved from an annual requirement to a biannual requirement.
Oh, that's nice.
For some reason. They just decided to do that. Some states you have to file something with their Secretary of State and your Attorney General and your Department of Revenue. Other states, there's nothing you have to file. So obviously the 990 is the most important, but those other state things are important too, because you can knock yourself out of compliance pretty quickly. Yeah.
And we want to make sure that the organization as a whole is compliant because if I'm on the board, that's part of my responsibility is to make sure that that's happening. I guess let's talk about how some of these play out practically and what board duties look like on a day-to-day level. So we know that boards are different at different sizes of organizations, right? So my working board for an organization that's $20,000 a year is going to look really different than my $20 million a year organization board. So we'll try to keep these general, but just understand for people that every board is a little bit different and that's okay. So in terms of financials, what do I need to be looking for as a board member to say, okay, things are okay, or, ooh, maybe I need to ask more questions here?
Yeah, no, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's probably the most important thing, right? Financials, money. Being an informed board member, being an active board member, again, even if you're not the treasurer or something like that is, when these transactions are proposed or these agreements are proposed, questions like permissibility, charitability, and legality at the end of the day are all important questions to ask. And again, that could be from the IRS's perspective, not as much from the states. They don't really care as much usually. Some are aggressive, I suppose, but certainly your federal tax exemption, right? That's going to be where the charitability and permissibility questions really matter. And I think, in those cases where it's not as obvious, that's where it makes sense to engage with an expert, whether that's an attorney, whether that's an accountant, depending on the situation, it could be both, could be either. They're just as qualified, right, to answer a lot of those same questions.
What would be kind of the general recommendation for how often I should be reviewing the financials as a board member?
There's no real, I would say, rule of thumb or black and white rule that we say. I would say that it really depends on what you're comfortable with. I think hopefully your treasurer is looking at things fairly often. I don't know if that means monthly. I don't know if that means weekly, but as a non-treasurer board member, as someone who's just invested, right? I would say, it's probably a good idea quarterly. But again, there's really no black and white rule for it. Again, it's what you're comfortable with and, what makes sense for you and your organization.
Yeah, and where your organization is in that kind of life cycle as well.
Yeah, again, like you said earlier, 20,000 versus 20 million, it's those are considerations. A $20,000 year organization, you probably don't need to look at it quarterly. You probably could get away with looking at it, a couple times a year. I don't know.
Sure.
But a bigger organization, those conversations probably need to happen more often. If that's your monthly board meeting, maybe.
Looking for reliable answers to your nonprofit's biggest legal questions? Visit charitableallies.org for free resources, case studies, and guides designed to help you protect your mission and grow your impact. That's charitableallies.org, your partner in building a stronger nonprofit. You mentioned this before. I'm interested, at what point should we as a board bring in outside help if there's something going on or questions that we have that aren't getting answered?
Right. Yeah, no. To me, I think when it makes sense to bring in somebody from the outside are those kinds of situations where either things are looking a little strange, or maybe you haven't had your meetings at a regular cadence for whatever reason, and you finally are kind of back on that schedule and you want to shore things up or make sure things are in a good spot. Certainly, when you're contemplating those bigger transactions, or you're thinking about engaging with a for-profit business, or you're thinking about maybe you want to work with your board member's company.
Sure.
Those would probably be big times to talk to somebody. Maybe when you're considering your annual filings, some people will employ an accounting firm to file their 990s and sometimes file their other state level documents. So and that obviously kind of goes without saying if you're in that situation. But if you're more of a casual board, I guess you could say, you're submitting your own documents yourself.
Sure.
It's probably a good idea to have somebody look them over before you submit them. Or certainly, if you knock yourself out of compliance or, something like that, then definitely it makes sense to talk to someone outside.
And it can be really empowering to say, okay, I might not know the answer to this, but I know somebody who does, and we can ask questions and then be able to move forward in a productive way, especially if they are in that situation where they haven't met in a while. Mm-hmm. They're just trying to figure out, okay, what are our duties here? What does this organization need? So those kind of assessment periods can be really good.
Yeah. I definitely have a couple of clients where, maybe we did a project for them at the outset, but, here we are 6 months, a year later, and it's kind of like a check-in. They'll reach out and just want us to look over a few things. We're not necessarily actively doing work for them. It's more about, okay, it's been a year, or, we're about to submit our 990s or our treasury reports, whatever it is. Can you look at this? Can you look at this transaction, this document, that type of a thing. Now
that we've kind of covered a lot of the basics of what the board is legally required to do, I think it's probably helpful for us to go into some best practices that, you're not going to get arrested for this or anything, but it's good best practice to help the organization you're looking to serve. So what are some kind of best practices you've seen on boards that were operating well?
Yeah, again, to me, it's number one, it's following your bylaws. If nothing else, it's understanding and following your bylaws. And, hopefully at some point you understand these are the 3 duties we talked about, but most of the time, right, people don't know about those. Sure. They know they have their bylaws. Sometimes they know they have articles of incorporation, whatever.
So when I join a board, I should ask for those documents.
Yes. If they're not immediately provided to you, you should ask for your bylaws, your articles, and any board policies. Because, some organizations, they have big old policy handbooks. Others have nothing. It's fine, right? It's whatever makes sense for you and your organization. So it's knowing and understanding those documents. And that's number one. I'd say number 2 is being an active participant. It's not just going to meetings like we've talked about. It's researching potentially, right, what the board chair wants to talk about, what that means. It's being involved and informally being an informed voter on things, not informally. And it's understanding like what these transactions or what these decisions will do for the organization. Because at the end of the day, right, you got a lot of leeway, you got a lot of flexibility, but everything that you're doing as a board in directing the organization has to be in furthering your charitable purpose. And
that's huge.
And your charitable mission, whatever that looks like, saving dogs, saving whales, providing diapers, I don't know, whatever.
And that can help avoid mission creep too. Mission creep is something that I think a lot of organizations fall prey to eventually at some point, where you're kind of tempted to say, okay, our organization might be a youth serving organization primarily, but
oh, well, we started serving more young adults and then we kind of got into programs that were more adult programs. And that's okay if you want to adapt your mission. But usually we see mission creep kind of taking away from the original mission.
Thanks for tuning in to 501 C-Suite, brought to you by Charitable Allies. To learn more about how we help nonprofits grow with confidence, visit charitableallies.org. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And share this with a fellow nonprofit leader who could use a trusted ally.